Welcome back to the channel. There are stories that begin with coincidence and end in fear. In the early 1972s, the quiet city of Rochester, New York, was the kind of place where children still walked to the corner store and neighbors knew each other by name. It was a typical American town, tucked between long winters and slow summers. But between 1971 and 1973, something dark began to move through those familiar streets. 3 little girls, each barely older than 10, would vanish, one after another, leaving behind families, friends, and a pattern so strange it would haunt investigators for decades. This is the story that came to be known as the Alphabet Murders. The first to disappear was Carmen Colón, a lively 10-year-old who set out one afternoon to run a quick errand. She never made it home. 2 days later, her body was found near Churchville, a small town outside Rochester. What caught attention first was the brutality of the crime. What came next was the coincidence. Carmen's initials C. C matched the first letter of the town where she was found. At first, few thought it meant anything. The city grieved, then tried to move on. But in April 1973, another girl went missing. Wanda Walkowicz, 11 years old, vanished while walking home from a store on Avenue D. The next morning, her body was discovered near Webster, east of the city. Again, the same chilling pattern. W. Wanda Walkowicz, found in Webster. By November of that same year, Rochester's sense of safety was already breaking. Then came Michelle Maenza, also 11, last seen walking from school. Her body was later recovered near Macedon. M. Another double initial. 3 girls, 3 towns, 3 matching pairs of letters. What had once felt like random tragedy began to look like a signature. The community panicked. Parents stopped letting their children walk alone. The police launched one of the largest investigations in local history, yet the killer seemed to vanish without trace. Clues surfaced: tire tracks, witness reports, a few fingerprints, but none led to a solid suspect. Half a century later, the questions still echo. Was the pattern deliberate or cruel coincidence? Did one person choose these victims because of their names, or did the mind of a frightened town create meaning where there was none? The Alphabet Murders remain officially unsolved. Each attempt to revisit the case only deepens the mystery. Still, the story endures not just as a record of crime, but as a reflection of fear itself. How patterns can both guide and deceive us. How a community's search for answers can turn into its own kind of obsession. And so tonight, we look back at Rochester between 1971 and 1973, a city caught between innocence and dread, where 3 children's names became symbols of something no one could explain. Each of the 3 girls who became part of the Alphabet Murders story had a small, ordinary life before tragedy found them. Their names are remembered together. Now Carmen, Wanda, Michelle, but they came from different corners of Rochester, from working-class families, each full of routines that should have been safe. Remembering who they were pulls the story back from the myth it became and reminds us what was lost. Carmen Colón was only 10. She was bold for her age, the kind of child who ran errands alone because everyone in the neighborhood knew her. On November 16, 1971, she left a local pharmacy to pick up a prescription for her grandmother. Witnesses later recalled seeing her looking nervous on Interstate 490, as if trying to escape a car. 2 days later, her body was found near Churchville, 20 miles away. Her short life became the first chapter in a nightmare no one yet recognized. Wanda Walkowicz, 11, was described as kind and serious, often helping her mother with chores. On April 2, 1973, she bought groceries for her family at a nearby store. When she did not come home, panic spread fast. The next day, her body was discovered in Webster by the side of a highway. Investigators noticed details that seemed eerily familiar: signs of strangulation, traces of sexual assault, and again, the double initials, W. W, found in Webster. Then came Michelle Maenza, another 11-year-old. Just months later, in November 1973, Michelle was shy, fond of her younger brother, and excited about an upcoming family trip. She was last seen walking home from school in broad daylight. 2 days later, her body turned up near Macedon, a rural area east of Rochester. The pattern M in Macedon was impossible to ignore. 3 girls, 3 sets of matching initials, 3 unsolved murders. Their cases were tied together not just by circumstance, but by an unnerving rhythm, as if the killer had been following a cruel design that only he understood. Even decades later, people in Rochester remember those names: Carmen's, Wanda's, Michelle's. For their families, time never delivered the closure they hoped for. For the city, their memory became part of its collective shadow, a reminder that danger does not always come from far away, and that sometimes even the simplest errands can become the point where history changes direction. Each victim's story holds a small mirror to innocence lost, and together they form the pattern that still defines one of America's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. When the 3rd victim was found, detectives could no longer dismiss the initials as chance. Each girl's first and last name began with the same letter, and so did the town where her body was discovered. C in Churchville, W in Webster, M in Macedon. It sounded almost like the work of someone sending a message, taunting investigators with a cruel sense of order. The newspapers caught the rhythm instantly. Double initial murders, one headline said, later shortened to the alphabet murders. The phrase stuck, and soon the community began seeing patterns everywhere. Every name, every town, every missing child report became part of a quiet panic. Parents whispered about strangers and marked routes on maps. Children were told to stay in groups. For investigators, the pattern created both focus and confusion. Was the killer deliberately choosing victims by name? Did he hunt girls he already knew, or pick them from the phone book? The idea of a man so obsessed with letters and symmetry turned the story from tragedy into myth. Detectives followed hundreds of leads, tracing anyone with a connection to all 3 families or neighborhoods. Nothing fit. Psychologists studying the case later said this fixation on the double initials revealed something about us, not just the killer. People look for order in horror. It is easier to believe there is logic, even a twisted one, than to face pure randomness. Maybe that is why the pattern still fascinates decades later. It promises meaning in the middle of chaos. For the police, though, meaning was not enough. They needed evidence: fingerprints, fibers, tire marks, and the alphabet clue led nowhere. No letters were left, no coded notes, no claims of responsibility. Just 3 children with names that happened to match. Still, the coincidence was too sharp to forget, too eerie to dismiss. It became the spine of the entire investigation. The strange geometry that turned 3 crimes into one haunting legend. The geography of the alphabet murders tells its own quiet story. The 3 towns, Churchville, Webster, and Macedon, form a rough triangle around Rochester, each about 20 miles apart. They were not isolated villages, but small, ordinary places threaded together by highways and suburban sprawl. Each town became a mark on a grim map, spreading fear in every direction. Churchville was first. A sleepy town west of the city, surrounded by farmland and winding roads. When Carmen Colón's body was found there, people tried to see it as a tragedy confined to one area. Then, as months passed, the anxiety faded until the second death shifted everything east. Webster sat near Lake Ontario, a quiet community where families picnicked by the water and students walked home from school in the afternoon light. When Wanda's body was discovered near the expressway, parents realized distance did not matter. The violence was moving, but it was not bound by geography. It was inside the same circle, somewhere nearby, watching. By the time Michelle was found in Macedon, the sense of pattern had hardened into dread. Macedon, a rural town lined with cornfields and back roads, felt far enough from Rochester to be safe. Yet safety was an illusion. 3 different girls, 3 towns, all within an hour's drive. Investigators mapped the routes, noting how close each abduction point was to major highways, places where someone could take a child and vanish in minutes. The roads that once meant freedom now became symbols of disappearance. Residents began to see the map differently. Churchville, Webster, Macedon names that once evoked calm, small-town life now sounded like warnings. Each crime scene was a reminder that evil did not belong to any one place. It could pass quietly from one corner of the county to another, leaving behind only initials, distance, and silence. The geography of fear, once drawn, never really fades. Even now, if you trace those towns on a map, you can almost feel the shape of something unfinished, 3 points connected by a mystery that still has not been solved. Each of the 3 murders bore the same brutal signature. All 3 victims were sexually assaulted and strangled, their bodies discarded near rural roads or wooded areas just outside town limits. Forensic reports described rope marks on the neck, bruising, and fibers that seemed to come from a vehicle's interior, details that linked the cases long before DNA testing existed. The killer seemed to know what he was doing. None of the scenes looked rushed. There were no obvious footprints, no careless items left behind. Whoever committed these acts was deliberate, methodical, and comfortable working in familiar territory. Investigators believed the person had access to a car, perhaps even a job that allowed travel across Monroe County's highway network. Autopsy results deepened the horror. The girls were alive when they were taken, and each seemed to have been kept for a short period, hours, not days, before being killed and left where they might be found. It was as though the killer wanted the discovery to be part of the message. The pattern of strangulation suggested control rather than chaos. It was not an impulsive act. It was personal, ritualistic even. Detectives debated whether the alphabet element might have been part of the ritual itself, a private code, or simply a cruel coincidence that the killer learned to mimic after the first death. In the early 1970 seconds, forensic science could only go so far. The investigators collected what they could: hair strands, tire impressions, bits of clothing, but the evidence was thin. Decades later, much of it degraded before DNA testing became reliable. Still, the recurring details, abduction in daylight, assault, strangulation, and the killer's careful disposal of the body made it clear this was not random violence. It was the work of someone who understood the landscape, who watched children from a distance, and who left behind no clear trail except for the eerie rhythm of his crimes. Each autopsy report was more than just documentation. Together, they formed a grim refrain that told investigators one thing: this was the same hand at work, moving silently through Rochester, choosing victims by pattern or by chance, but always leaving the same trace of quiet terror behind. Before the Alphabet murders, Rochester was an ordinary city industrial, but close-knit, where kids roamed the streets after school and neighbors shared porches. After the killings, that sense of comfort collapsed almost overnight. Parents who once waved their children out the door began walking them everywhere. Windows that had stayed open for summer air were nailed shut by autumn. Every missing child rumor set off panic. Police lines flooded with calls about strange cars or men seen near playgrounds. For years, the community lived in a low, constant hum of fear. Even the city's layout started to feel different. The same streets that once marked freedom now carried a quiet menace. Churchville, Webster, Macedon, ordinary towns, suddenly whispered like curses. Teachers talked to students about safety. Churches held vigils. Neighborhood watches formed, though no one really knew what to watch for. Local papers printed sketches, lists of safety rules, reassurances from police, but none of it worked. The murders were not just crimes. They had become a collective trauma, reshaping how people saw innocence and danger. In those years, Rochester lost something it never got back. It was not only the 3 children. It was the assumption that good places could protect you. Kids stopped taking shortcuts through fields. Parents started keeping lights on all night. Police cruisers parked near schools became part of the landscape, as familiar as mailboxes. And through it all, the pattern, the double initials, the town's haunted conversation. Each new coincidence, each story about a stranger, felt like a possible continuation. Some people even changed their children's routes or avoided certain streets, beginning with C, W, or M. The Alphabet murders did not just take lives. They took a generation's ease. Rochester learned to live with the tension of waiting between the ordinary and the unthinkable, between wanting answers and fearing what the truth might reveal. From the beginning, the investigation into the Alphabet murders was both urgent and uncertain. Rochester police, Monroe County deputies, and the New York State Police formed task forces that worked around the clock. For a while, the community believed an arrest was close. But the case soon fractured under its own complexity. Too many tips, too few facts, and no clear suspect who fit all 3 crimes. In 1971, after Carmen Colón's murder, police questioned a family acquaintance named Michelle Colón, who had fled to Puerto Rico shortly after her death. Evidence against him was circumstantial. A suspicious car, a quick disappearance, but enough to make him the primary suspect. When investigators traveled to question him, Miguel took his own life before they could proceed. The case went cold, though many officers privately believed he had been involved in Carmen's death. Then came Wanda and Michelle. Their murders shared too many details to ignore, but the link to Miguel no longer made sense. Detectives began to suspect a separate offender, or worse, a serial killer who had studied the first case. The search expanded across the region. Interviews with hundreds of men, door-to-door sweeps, stakeouts near schools. Over the years, files grew thick with reports and false leads. Cars similar to the one described near the abduction scenes were traced and dismissed. Tips about drifters, factory workers, and even clergy came and went. Some detectives believed the killer was local, a man who blended in too well. Others thought he was a traveler, someone using Rochester's highways to move unseen. When DNA testing became reliable in the 1,990 seconds, samples from the victims were retested, but degradation and contamination limited what could be recovered. The results excluded some suspects, but confirmed nothing. The case shifted into the realm of cold case units still active, but gathering dust between bursts of attention. Through every decade, new investigators reopened the boxes of evidence, hoping that better technology might reveal something the first generation had missed. Yet even now, after 50 years, the Alphabet murders remain one of New York's most haunting failures, a reminder of how quickly a case can slip beyond reach, no matter how determined the pursuit. Every generation of detectives has its own theory about who killed the 3 girls. None of them fit perfectly. The first and most obvious name was Michelle Colón, Carmen's relative. He owned a car similar to the one witnesses described, and he left the country right after her murder. But his death in Puerto Rico by apparent suicide closed that door before police could truly test it. The remaining 2 murders happened after he was gone, breaking the theory apart. Later, attention turned toward Kenneth Bianchi, one half of the Hillside Stranglers who terrorized California in the late 1970s. Before moving west, Bianchi had lived in Rochester and worked nearby. His method: strangulation, manipulation of victims, and fascination with control mirrored parts of the Alphabet murders. Yet when DNA comparisons were finally possible decades later, they did not match. Bianchi himself denied any link, though he reveled in the attention, as many killers do when connected to unsolved cases. A more recent name is Joseph Naso, a California serial killer convicted of murdering women whose initials also matched the towns where they were found. Another eerie parallel: Naso once lived in New York, close enough for suspicion to make sense. But investigators have never confirmed a solid link, and again, DNA has failed to tie him directly to Rochester's crimes. Other theories paint broader possibilities: a truck driver who used the highway network to find victims, a factory worker who moved across shifts in neighborhoods, or a man who simply blended in so well no one ever thought to look twice. A few locals even whispered about multiple offenders, copycats who picked up on the pattern after the first killing. For all the speculation, the truth keeps slipping between the cracks. The lack of solid forensic evidence means every suspect ends up as a ghost, their shadow visible only when the light of a new theory hits them. The most haunting part is not that no one knows who did it. It is that someone, somewhere, got away with killing 3 children and might have lived an ordinary life afterward, surrounded by people who never suspected a thing. Decades after the murders, science became the only voice left to question. The original investigators had gathered what evidence they could: clothing fibers, fingerprints, traces of hair, but in the early 1970s, that was often as far as technology could go. When DNA profiling emerged in the late 80s and 90s, the samples were fragile, degraded by time, yet hope resurfaced. Cold case detectives reopened the evidence boxes. They recatalogued every item, ran fresh tests, and uploaded what DNA they could recover into national databases. It was painstaking work: fibers too faint, blood too old, files written in fading typewriter ink. But each retest carried the same quiet question: could modern science identify the ghost who once walked among them? By the early 2022s, genetic genealogy, the same tool that cracked cases like the Golden State Killer, was brought into play. Investigators began comparing partial DNA profiles from the Rochester evidence against public genealogy databases, hoping a relative might surface. So far, no match has led to an arrest, but the renewed effort confirmed one crucial fact: at least 2 of the murders share a single unknown male DNA profile. That means one killer, not coincidence. The state police also began using advanced forensic mapping, 3D reconstructions of the dump sites, weather recreations, even soil composition to trace where the killer might have parked or approached. It is not glamorous detective work. It is slow science, trying to make the silence speak again. Each new test carries both promise and frustration. Technology evolves faster than certainty. Every few years, Rochester's cold case team returns to the same evidence table, holding out hope that the next innovation will finally reveal a name. Until then, the DNA sits preserved in sterile vials, a whisper from 1973, waiting for someone, somewhere, to share the right strand of code and bring an ending to the story. Even half a century later, the Alphabet murders have not been shelved. As of 2025, the New York State Police confirmed that the case remains active. A quiet word that means detectives are still looking, even when the news stops talking. Every few years, evidence is reopened, tested, and compared against expanding DNA databases. In recent years, investigators have leaned heavily on forensic genealogy, comparing old samples to modern genetic records. These efforts echo breakthroughs in other cold cases, but in Rochester's story, the results have been slower. Partial DNA profiles exist, but no confirmed familial link has yet been found. Each test ends in the same suspended breath, almost, but not quite. Media coverage occasionally flares back to life. Articles in 2023 and 2025 revisited the murders, connecting them to new suspects or forensic advances. One report mentioned the possibility of examining similarities to serial killer Joseph Naso, who had targeted women with matching initials in California. But so far, no official evidence connects him or anyone to the crimes. The modern phase of the case looks less like a chase and more like a vigil. Detectives now work beside archivists and scientists, piecing together a half-century of paperwork, digitizing every photograph, every fiber report. Forensic specialists handle the evidence like relics, aware that each sample may represent the last physical voice of the victims. The renewed investigation carries quiet hope, but also frustration. The technology exists to solve it. What is missing may simply be time or luck. Yet the persistence itself matters. It signals that the city has not forgotten Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle. Each new test, each interview, is a small defiance against the years that tried to bury them. In 2025, the Alphabet murders remain open, not because of mystery's allure, but because Rochester still wants an ending worthy of its dead children, and maybe, someday soon, science will give them one. For all the files, theories, and technology, the Alphabet murders remain one of those cases that sit uneasily between sense and chaos. Every time investigators think they have found the key, the lock changes shape. Was it truly one killer, weaving a cruel code of initials and geography? Or were the murders separate, stitched together later by coincidence and fear? The biggest question is still motive. Why the pattern? Was the double initial connection intentional, or an eerie accident that shaped how everyone saw the case afterward? Detectives have argued both sides for decades. Some insist the killer deliberately chose the girls for their names, a signature of control, almost ritualistic. Others see the pattern as something the public projected onto unrelated tragedies, a psychological need to find order where none existed. Another lingering doubt concerns the timeline. Did the killer stop because he was caught for another crime? Did he move, die, or simply decide he would done enough to make his point? Serial offenders rarely just vanish. They either evolve or get careless. Yet in Rochester, the violence ended as suddenly as it began. 3 murders in 2 years, and then nothing. That silence may be the strangest part of all. There are smaller questions too. Why no witnesses ever saw the abductions in broad daylight? How the killer transported the victims unnoticed? Why certain clues, like tire marks or foreign fibers, never led to a match? Each missing answer keeps the case alive, not as a puzzle to solve, but as a wound that refuses to scar over. Even with new forensic methods, there is an emotional truth investigators can't test in a lab. the unease that the murderer might have lived an ordinary life afterward, blending back into the crowd. Maybe he was someone people waved to, someone who fixed their car, bagged their groceries, or went to their church. That thought, ordinary evil hiding in plain sight, is what gives the alphabet murders their lasting gravity. So the case stays open, half legend, half evidence. The files are still pulled from the shelves, not because detectives expect a miracle, but because unanswered questions demand attention. Sometimes justice is not about closure, it is about refusing to stop asking. Time dulls most stories, but not this one. In Rochester, the alphabet murders still hover like a shadow stitched into the city's memory. The victims' names, Carmen, Wanda, Michelle, appear on anniversaries, candlelight vigils, and the occasional local documentary. Schools and neighborhoods that once stood near the crime scenes have changed, yet the fear they birthed lingers quietly in the way people teach their children caution. True crime writers and filmmakers have returned to the story over and over, drawn by its eerie symmetry. The double initials, the 3-year span, the sudden stop. It is a mystery that feels written for the human imagination. Books, podcasts, even fictional adaptations have borrowed from it, each trying to find meaning in the pattern that the killer left behind. Some treat it as a riddle, others as a meditation on randomness and grief. For Rochester's older residents, though, it is not just legend, it is personal history. They remember the posters on telephone poles, the police checkpoints, the way parents clutched their children's hands tighter after dusk. Many still keep the news clippings, yellowed and folded, as if waiting for the headline that never came: "Arrest made in alphabet murders." The case also changed the way local law enforcement handled child abductions. Procedures for missing children became faster, communication between departments tighter. Even without a conviction, the tragedy forced progress small, bureaucratic victories paid for in innocence. And so the story remains: 3 graves, 3 towns, 1 unbroken mystery. Each generation inherits it like a ghost story whispered around campfires, except this one is real. The alphabet murders do not just live in police files. They live in the way people look at patterns, coincidences, and the darkness that sometimes hides in plain sight. Half a century on, Rochester still waits for a name. Not because it would erase the fear, but because it might finally let the city exhale. Until that day, the alphabet murders stay open in evidence rooms, in memory, and in the uneasy quiet of a place that once trusted its streets too much. When you pull back from all the details, the initials, the maps, the suspects, the science, you are left with something both simple and devastating. 3 children who never made it home. That is the core of the alphabet murders. Beneath every theory and newspaper headline lies a truth about fear, chance, and how a community learns to live with what it can't explain. Rochester's story reminds us that evil does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it moves quietly, hiding behind the small coincidences of ordinary life. The double initials might have been a code, or just cruel luck, but what kept the case alive was not the mystery itself. It was the refusal to forget. Each time investigators reopen the evidence, each time someone tells the story again, it is an act of memory, not just curiosity. Maybe one day, a DNA match or a long-held confession will close the circle. But until then, the alphabet murders stand as a mirror showing what happens when the unknown lingers too long. Thank you for being here tonight, for walking through this dark chapter of history with care. If you found this story compelling, stay tuned for the next case. We will explore another mystery, another glimpse into the shadows of the past. Take care of yourselves and of the small, ordinary safeties we too easily forget.